Hi, everyone. We're just going to sort of take a moment and wait for people to join. Yeah, we're seeing the numbers come on. It would be great if you would like to say hi in the chat to each other. Let us know where you're all coming from. We got Bangkok. Wow, that's amazing. I love it when we hear from people all over the world. Cindy coming from Bangkok. Who else we've got? New Zealand, Karen from New Zealand, Pennsylvania. Oh my goodness, Vancouver, Memphis, Mary from California, Shirley from Colorado. We've got BC, Nicole in BC. Wow. So, LA, Australia, Wisconsin. That's where I grew up. Michigan, California. Welcome, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. It really is this lovely satsang from around the world. And it's just nice to feel the hearts of all these people on this path together. Sort of, I always think of it as this web around the world, these brilliant hearts connected, even though we can't quite see each other. At least we can say hi. This is our last webinar of this course. Can you believe it? We're on week 8. We made it. I'm so excited that we've gotten through all this material together. If this is your first time joining us, I just wanted to quick introduce myself. I'm Jackie Dobrinska. I'm the Education and Community Outreach Director for Love, Serve, Remember Foundation and one of the creators of this course, sort of curating this course. And you are the Ram Dass Satsang. So hopefully it has been a really rich 8 weeks for you. So how tonight works, we just encourage you to make connections in the chat. If you have questions, please type them into the Q&A. There's a little button at the bottom, you hit that, and that's where we'll type your questions. You can ask them at any time. You can turn on closed captioning. There's also at the bottom a little CC. You hit that, might be under more, and then you can either see live transcripts on the side or at the bottom, in case that's helpful for you. We are muted just because there's lots of people here. It makes it easier to not just have lots of things going on. If you are looking to have some more connection and you haven't yet made it, really encourage you to come to the Thursday meetup where we'll have a little bit of a closing ceremony, which will be really sweet. And if you want to continue to come to gatherings like this one or like the Thursday meetup, make sure you join the Ram Dass Fellowship, which is ramdass.org/fellowship, because we have these things every month, a live stream and a meetup. So that's the housekeeping portion. So let's dive this week. Our last week, we dive into aging and dying. And in part because our Western culture is just not really good at honoring death. I would argue that we're not really great at honoring life in a lot of ways as well, but we definitely don't honor death. And yet none of us get out of here alive. So it's this idea of not taking death as the enemy or an error, but really just this cycle of life. And that aging is sort of when we begin to face that fear and really open to death as a potential awakening, a path to awakening. So to talk more about this is someone I just adore, Ram Dev, also known as Dale Borglum. He is the founder and director of the Hanuman Foundation Dying Center in Santa Fe, New Mexico, which is the first residential facility in the US to support conscious dying. He's been the executive director of the Living Dying Project in Santa Fe, and since 1986 in the San Francisco Bay Area. And he's the co-author with Ram Dass of Journey of Awakening, a meditator's guidebook. He's been teaching meditation since 1974. And he has been a guide to me when I was navigating a friend dying in a really, really amazing and helpful way. So I really appreciate his wisdom and him being with us tonight. So from all of us around the world in this sort of etheric virtual world, let's open our loving hearts and give a warm welcome to Dale Ram Dev, as he tells us about a little bit about dying and death this evening.
Thank you, Jackie. Thank you so much. Welcome, everybody. So I've been the director of the Living Dying Project, or before that, even the Dying Project, since back in the 70s. And to be honest with you, I'm not that interested in death. I'm interested in awakening. I'm interested in waking up. And in fact, one of my first meditation teachers Trungpa Rinpoche said that until one comes into intimate contact with death, your spiritual practice will have the quality of you being a dilettante. In a very real way, all fear is based on fear of death, the place where we're lost in our separateness. In the East, in Hinduism and Buddhism particularly, the dying process is seen as an incredibly wonderful opportunity for awakening, because as we're dying, we no longer have a body. Right now, it seems like I'm here in Fairfax, California, and you guys are scattered all around the world, but I'm in this body and you're in that body. And it's very difficult to let go of the solidity of that assumption. So that in the West, as opposed to the East seeing death as an opportunity for awakening, in the West, death is often seen as a big problem to be avoided at all costs. And as long as we're pushing that away, that energy of pushing isn't used in being alive, being able to love, being able to create. So until we can really have a very intimate relationship with the fact that we're going to die eventually, it's going to be very difficult to be fully alive. In fact, in Tibetan Buddhism, before one even begins to practice, there are what are called the 4 mind-turning truths, where people do contemplations, not just thinking about something intellectually, but really taking it deep within. And the first one is you're going to die, but you don't know when. You're going to die, but you don't know when. What could be more obvious intellectually? Yet if you and I really knew that we were going to die and we didn't know when, how would it affect this next hour that we're spending together? Very likely we won't see each other again. This is a very precious moment in that sense. But beyond that, we don't even know that we're going to be alive at the end of this hour. Can we go beyond all of our concepts of I'm the expert and I'm here to teach something and you're here to get something? And how alive can we really be? How much can we surrender into the moment? How much can we die into the next moment? Excuse me. Another of my first meditation teachers, Suzuki Roshi, said, the most important thing is finding the most important thing. So what is the most important thing? Is it waking up? Is it being happy? Is it having a good time? And if in fact the most important thing is waking up, then it becomes imperative for us to really begin to look at our fear. What is it that's separating us from being alive moment to moment to moment? Ram Dass had this great slogan kind of that he put together when we were with Maharaji in India. Faith, comma, no fear. Fear, comma, no faith. So that to the extent we're afraid of death, we're fearing loneliness, we're lost in grief, there's not enough faith. To the extent we can increase our faith, then there's no fear. So today, during this first 30-minute lecture part of what we're doing, I'm going to explore 2 ways of dealing with that slogan. One way is increasing faith. The other way is reducing fear. And I really notice that in my life, whenever I'm caught in something, particularly fear, it's a very direct expression of the fact that I don't have enough faith in that moment in God, in Maharaji, in Hanuman, in whatever there is that I trust. And is it possible then to deepen faith? What is it that I have faith in? Do I trust Maharaji? Do I trust God more than I'm afraid of what's going on financially or in relationships or in my body or all these different things? So that the fact that on a daily basis, or at least an almost daily basis, I'm talking to people who are dying, it keeps reminding me that death is an eventuality, it's real, But at the same time, I can have a certain faith that will cut through any fear that might arise. Maharaji said, the body passes away. Everything is impermanent except love for God. The world is just a dream, an illusion. You can't take anything with you when you die. The only thing that's important is how much you love God. So no matter where you are in the spiritual path, no matter how many years or months you've been meditating or saying mantras or whatever your practice is about, that's really preparation for this leap into faith. That practice is called practice because it's practice for this leap. And in certain schools of Buddhism, going into the spaciousness of realizing we aren't a body is preceded by deeply going into qualities of devotion and compassion. Devotion is easier than compassion because devotion is opening our hearts to God, whereas compassion is a little harder. Sometimes it's a lot harder because compassion is opening our heart when there is suffering. Compassion is often a mixture of sadness and joy. You probably are aware of the news that this apartment complex, condo, whatever it is, in close to Miami Beach has collapsed, and there might be 160 people who are still unaccounted for in the rubble. Just imagine you're in your bed, minding your own business, and boom, all of a sudden the building you are just collapses without any notice at all. In that moment, how strong is your faith? In that moment, do you go, oh my God, or do you go, oh my God, and surrender into that quality of being with God, being with the mother? Maharaji also talked a lot about loving the mother with a capital M, that in a way, it's all the mother. My body's the mother, the sound of my voice is the mother, the energy in my body, thoughts, everything that we can experience, everything is a manifestation of the mother. Do we have a loving, intimate relationship with the mother? Do we have faith in the surrender that the mother is taking care of her loving child? Or on the other hand, do we keep getting caught and there's a world out there that we have to be afraid of? So suppose one of your practices is saying a mantra. The very first level of practice in developing this faith that will cut through fear of death is a sense of invocation, of reaching out, of hoping that God shows up, if you will. You're saying Ram, 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 for example, with the remembrance that at times Ram has been there. Maybe right now you don't feel it. You're saying Ram in the sense of invoking this intimacy. And then eventually the heart begins to open. And there is this feeling of connection. There's this relationship, this romance going on. We're no longer practicing from the standpoint of poverty and need, but from a sense of romance and abundance and connection. We have this connection with God, with the divine, with the sacred. And as we go into that, and as it deepens and deepens, eventually the quality of the mother, the quality of a tantric relationship with reality begins to arise. And we begin to realize that all this stuff, all this that we're invoking, all of the mantra even, is our own true nature. It's not something other. It's not something out there, that we are divine. One brief Maharaji story. We were with Maharaji one day and Ram Dass was having a kind of a hard day. Maharaji would push everybody to the edge at times. And he came to Maharaji and said, Maharaji, I feel so impure. Please help me. I feel so impure. And Maharaji looked up Ram Dass's sleeve and he looked inside and he said, I don't see any impurity. I don't see any impurity. Imagine being with somebody who all they see is your wholeness. You are neurotic, you have this problem, you have that problem, you have all these conditionings from childhood. But when we get to this certain level of awakeness that certainly Maharaji had, it's all whole, it's all the mother. Now, when we say that it's all the mother, we're not denying the human side. We're not denying the fact that people are suffering, that the loved ones of the people who were in that collapsing tower, or I just talked to somebody an hour and a half ago who was just diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. And she's trying to decide if she should buy another tube of toothpaste, because maybe she's not going to need another tube of toothpaste. She's going to die before the old tube of toothpaste runs out. She literally said that to me an hour and a half ago. And imagine being in that situation. Okay, so that both of these are true. And that's, to me, what working with death, what becoming intimate with death really awakens, that there's this human dimension, the sadness part of compassion, that there is suffering in the world, but there's also the open-hearted wholeness, the joyfulness, so that there's sadness in relationship to the suffering, but there's joyfulness because of the open heart. So right now in this moment, realizing that there's suffering in your life, probably in your own body and the people around you. Certainly, if we look at the news, we don't have to look very far to find out who's suffering where. Even though that's going on, is it possible to breathe into the heart and breathe out spaciousness? One of the qualities of the compassionate heart is spacious, a spacious heart, beyond concept. Like the way Maharaji was saying that the world is just a dream. Well, it's also real. It's a dream and it's real at the same time, which is something he also said. Can we breathe out into that spaciousness, realizing that there is this aliveness, this joyfulness, this awakeness that includes dying, includes aging, includes bodies that can't do the things that they used to do 10 years ago, 20 years ago. When I was at the dying center, we had a client, rather young guy, who was dying of a cancer in his head and his neck. And one day he said to me, he said, I used to be able to play basketball. I really love to play basketball. Now I can't do that. I really love to eat chili rellenos. I can't eat chili rellenos anymore. I really love to do that. I can't go to the bathroom by myself anymore. I really like being able to go to the bathroom by myself. But I feel like I'm being essentialized. I feel like I'm being whittled down to who I really am. So that in some very direct and real way, this contemplation, you're going to die, but you don't know when. If we just hold that in the back of our consciousness, in the back of our mind in a certain way, then we are whittled away, that we have these identities, these abilities. You're a rich person or a poor person. You're a smart person or a not so smart person. You're all these identities we have, they're going to die. Every one of them is going to die. Everything, your body's going to die. Your mind is going to die. All your stuff is going to be gone. All your friends are going to be gone. All that's left is consciousness. How do we prepare for that moment? So one way, as I'm saying, is increasing faith so that dying is just another moment of being in love with God. Whether we do that through saying this mantra where we invoke and then we're in this relationship and then we feel this tantric wholeness and the sense that what we invoked is who we really are, or we're doing it through meditation, or we're just totally in love with God, doesn't really make any difference. But getting to that point where in any moment we can come back to faith. And I keep thinking of how uncertain death is, how we don't know when it's going to happen. I mean, it might be that when I'm dying or you're dying, we're in an automobile and the person you love most in the world is in the seat next to you and that car is spinning out of control. Or it might be that when you're dying, you're on the floor of the local supermarket, pharmacy, whatever, and some stranger is pounding on your chest and breathing into your mouth. Or it may be when you're dying that there's so many opioids in your bloodstream that you can't even focus your mind. So that really, this is the moment to practice consciousness. This is the moment to how alive, how awake can I be right now? So this notion of conscious death, which falls back to conscious life, preparing for conscious death. What does it mean to be conscious? Ram Dass wrote a book that I think I remember was called Be Here Now. And the first level of consciousness is just being here now, being present, having a clear mindfulness, if you will, being in the moment. But eventually then, as mindfulness deepens, we need to bring the heart in. We need to have a loving relationship with what we're mindful of. And in fact, Ram Dass, toward the end of his life, his main practice was loving awareness, not just awareness, not just being here now, but being here now with love, being here now with compassion. So that now there's two things to do. You're being aware, mindful, and you're opening your heart. And in fact, recent studies by neuroscientists and psychologists and meditators have shown that mindfulness leads to increased well-being, but mindfulness combined with compassion deeply speeds up the movement into well-being. So now we're doing two things. We're opening our heart to the fact that people are dying and here's what our life is and all the stuff that's going on. And as the heart becomes more and more, excuse me, open and spacious, it's connected. An open heart is a connected heart. It's connected to our own self. It's connected to God. It's connected to all other beings. Those are the three qualities, theoretically, at least, of the open heart: connected, spacious, and warm. So you have this connected heart, this spacious heart, and it's spacious enough that the eye that we hold on to is just one thought in the vast sky of mind. We begin to become more interested in the sky and the quality of mind itself than the content. Like right now, I'm talking, I can hear my voice, my body's moving around, I'm doing the Dale talking thing. But as I'm doing this, am I connected? Am I connected with God? Am I connected with a spacious heart? Is my heart big enough to include people in Australia and New Zealand and Chile, and I forget all the names that were popping up when Jackie was doing the chat thing in the beginning, but people all over the world. Can my heart be big enough to include all of you, which means it's big enough to include all the suffering? So that compassion, a deep compassion, is necessary to open up enough to go beyond fear of death, to go into this quality of non-duality that Ramana Maharshi, Eckhart Tolle, Ram Dass, Adyashanti, Dale Borglum, a lot of people talk about this quality of non-duality. And that's really crucial to this discussion about dying, because it's what we die into. We die into pure consciousness. Right now, you and I are enlightened. Right now, there's not something to accomplish or understand to get to wholeness. It's letting things be fully. It's accepting the way it is now in a radical, surrendered way. But usually we think we've got to practice, we've got to get somewhere, that spiritual practice is a self-improvement project. And certainly we do need to learn to deal with suffering. We need to deepen compassion, deepen mindfulness. But another track of the spiritual path is learning to bear the light, learning to bear the joy, the purity of God's presence. In India, there's a garden where in Vrindavan where Radha and Krishna come out and play every night. And they say that if you are in that garden overnight, you will see Radha and Krishna making love, but it's so incredible that you'll go crazy. And what I'm getting at here is, can we go into our hearts enough that we can see God making love all the time without going crazy? When one dies, according to the Tibetans, one sees a light that's as bright as 1,000 suns. Right now, that light is here. It's not something that's only there when we're dying, but it's revealed when we're dying because we're letting go of identification with our body. So that to the extent that you or I find that love is too frightening because love involves surrender and involves in some way becoming nobody, to the extent that we feel that love is too scary, then death is going to be too scary. Is it possible that we can deepen our ability to love during this life so that when we're dying, the pure light of consciousness that's as bright as 1,000 suns is not too bright? So in these contemplative traditions, early Christianity, the Tibetan Book of the Dead, other scriptures, they talk about how one can die fully, how one can prepare to die completely. And that breath we were talking about before, breathing into the heart, and then breathing out into spaciousness in all directions. Can you breathe into your heart? Just imagine you had nostrils in the center of your chest right now. Breathing into your heart, letting your heart break open, and then surrendering into into infinite spaciousness in all directions. Up, down, front, back, right, left. Breathing into the heart, breathing out into infinite spaciousness. And those places where that surrender into spaciousness catches, where we get a little frightened, that's the place to look. That's the place to have compassion for self. So when we get too focused on form, I'm Dale talking to you, I'm in California. When we get too focused on form, we tend to get too uptight. We can't bear the vastness of love. Well, let's see how much more time we have. We have about 5 more minutes maybe. So there's wonderful practices to help prepare for dying. One of them is forgiveness. There have been very few people I have guided as they were dying, who wanted to die more consciously, who didn't need to work with forgiveness. It's 3 kinds of forgiveness: forgiving ourselves, forgiving someone else, and asking someone else to forgive us. Almost always at the end of life, people haven't forgiven themselves. They feel, if I only would have done this, I only would have done that. I wish I hadn't hurt that person. And to begin to just say, Ramdev, I forgive you. Dale, I forgive you, whatever your name is. And imagine what it would feel like to be forgiven. Or imagine what it would be like to die if you haven't forgiven yourself. I'm not suggesting that this is a quick fix. Very often we are so conditioned, there's so much momentum behind the feelings of guilt and shame and unworthiness that it makes it very difficult to forgive ourselves. But the people that I have been with who have died most fully and openly and with such radiance are people who forgave themselves and forgave the people around them. So that every time you judge somebody in your life, or you look into the mirror and judge that person looking back at you, and you do that unconsciously, it makes it just a little bit harder to die fully and consciously. And every time you catch yourself being slightly critical and you forgive yourself and open to that person with love, that part of yourself, you're creating a new neural pathway. The image I have in my mind is there are these grooves in my brain. I mean, I know it's just an image. And that every time I get caught in the groove of judgment, the groove gets a little bit deeper and it's a little harder not to do that next time. But every time I turn toward love instead of toward judgment, it's like God pours some nectar into that groove and makes it not quite so deep. filling up the groove, so that the people in our lives who are difficult to be around are actually gifts that are preparing us to die well if we can work with the way that our heart closes. I'm not going to get into politics here, but clearly we've been living through a very politically divisive time. Republicans, Democrats, boom, boom, all this stuff going on. And whether you're a Republican or a Democrat or whatever your politics are, there's been so much hatred, so much criticism, people not communicating. Not only is dying well something we can talk about individually, but collectively, is our society in some way dying? Do we need to learn collectively to open to the light, to be able to not be so critical? And of course, that's true. Whether we're going to be able to get around to that sort of remains to be seen. So seeing that the grasping itself is empty, seeing that we can go beyond concept and rest in pure nature is the essence of going into conscious dying. Mind essence, the essence of consciousness, Rigpa in Tibetan, Satchitananda in the words of Ramana Maharshi, can be noticed between breaths, between thoughts, between sounds. So that, as an example, right now, just put all of your attention on listening to the sound of my voice, listening to the sound of my voice. That's all you need to do. What continues when I stop? Is there an awakeness? Is there an aliveness that continues whether I'm talking or not? Can you feel that awakeness that's so familiar, that's always there, that we don't pay attention to it, that we get fixated? We tend to get fixated on the content of things. We tend to get fixated on, I like this, I don't like that, I don't want to die, I don't like Republicans, I don't like Democrats, whatever. And we fail to notice the consciousness that is experiencing things. In a way, from a Buddhist standpoint, this quality of conscious living, which leads to conscious dying, is beginning to identify with consciousness itself rather than the content. Dzogchen, Advaita Vedanta, Mahamudra. Rather than being lost in all the illusory stuff of life, we rest in God consciousness. So going back to what Maharaji said, the only thing that's important is how much you love God. Everything is impermanent except love of God. The body passes away. That's his way of saying exactly what the Buddhists were saying. So that each moment is filled with God's grace. Rather than grasping, rather than being lost in, here's me doing this, doing that, trusting the grace filling us and flowing through us allows us then to die well. So I mentioned that forgiveness is one of the practices that help people die well. Another practice that, let me see the time here, I guess I'm almost out of time. Another practice is that meditation, dissolving into space from the heart. Another practice is guru yoga, imagining the guru in front of you and just slowly merging your body into the body of the beloved, and then that body merging into spaciousness itself. There are practices called Powa and the Ah breath. And in fact, this would be a great time for me to mention that the Living Dying Project that I run has the most complete website on the internet about conscious dying, www.livingdying.org, so that these practices that I'm talking about are mentioned in great detail and specificity on the website. So I think that I'm kind of running out of time here, Jackie. Do you want to jump in?
Sure, that was amazing. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom. And thank you for the resources on the practices as well. Those practices sound really lovely. At the very end, you had mentioned a little bit about trusting the grace of the moment. I'm curious if you could talk, in the beginning, you talked a fair amount about faith. And it feels like faith and trust go hand in hand, and a lot of us have broken trust. How do we have more trust, more faith? Does it make sense?
It makes sense. It's a very big question.
We like to
And
start off big.
so people say to me, "You're so lucky you got to meet Maharaji." Right?
Yeah.
There I was in India at his feet, touching his feet, being there. And even having that experience, my faith fails again and again. Do I have enough money to do this? Does this person like me? As years go by, that happens less and less. But your question is really the fundamental question of spirituality. And it can be approached from different ways, of course. One way is to, in a very Buddhist way, begin to notice that when you don't have faith, suffering arises. When we get caught in fear, when we get caught in grasping, there is suffering there. Suffering doesn't feel good. And there is actually this sense of intrinsic wholeness, that we're whole already, that just by noticing how we suffer when we don't have faith, there will be a natural movement, slow and erratic though it may be, to greater faith. And I would guess that in your life and in my life, and anybody who's trying to pay attention, this movement towards faith is happening. The other is to pray for faith, to say your mantra with this reaching out quality, so that, as I was saying before, you can, whether it's meditation or saying a mantra, it can be done from different levels of consciousness. In the beginning, it's like, I don't have enough faith, but please connect with me here. You know, I'm trying, I'm saying the mantra, I'm meditating. And then there's a relationship. Then eventually, at least at times, sporadically, there's this sense of, there's me and there's Maharaji, there's me and there's the mother, there's me and there's Hanuman or Buddha Dharma Sangha, and that I'm resting in that place, and it's juicy and it's wonderful. And as that deepens, then we go into Tantra, where that I am the mantra itself. It's not something out there. So it's the spiritual path, how we choose to set foot on the spiritual path. I wish there were a magic trick. I mean, some people take psychedelics to increase faith. Maharaji said, if you don't have faith, taking psychedelics one time will enable you to go into the room with Christ and have his darshan, be with him fully, but then you've got to go out and be able to do it yourself. So whether it's meditation or faith or mantra or psychedelics, or consciousness doesn't care how you get there. And it doesn't care how long it takes or how much it hurts. It's just, oh boy. So the point is, you find the way that works for you to cultivate deeper faith. And it's not the same for everybody. I mean, when I first started teaching, I felt everybody should do what I do, but that's not quite the way it works. I mean, some people are very intellectual, some people are really heart-based, some people are body-based. And as my life has evolved, I see that it's really very personal what path takes us to deeper faith.
Yeah, and I really like that invitation to start with. It almost sounded like honesty and willingness, like just that honesty of where we are and willingness to open to something greater.
Yeah.
We have a lot of amazing questions coming in. One that's been repeated a couple of times is around self-forgiveness. What does it look like to forgive someone who has harmed us? Is it always necessary? How do we work on self-forgiveness, especially with judgments we've had on ourselves and others for so long, seemed sort of glued into the relationship?
Right. Another great question. So there's a quality of the psyche called the superego, the inner critic, that Jackie is smiling because she's familiar.
I know it so well.
as we all do. And the superego, the inner critic is one of the voices that makes it most difficult to meditate. So when you hear that voice, it's very difficult not to believe it, because it's the voice of survival. When you were very young, it said, you've got to pay attention here because these big people don't trust your intuition. There are all these rules. You shouldn't defecate here. You shouldn't write on the wall. You shouldn't make too much noise when daddy's trying to read the paper, whatever it is. Don't trust yourself. Listen to this critical voice. So that now we grow up and we're not children, but that voice is very powerful. It's hard not to believe it. It takes a lot of practice. It takes standing up and saying, no, I don't believe you. It's just another voice in the mind. And even being at the end of a long meditation retreat, that voice is telling me, you're not doing it quite right. You got to go 5 degrees to the right here, 10 degrees to the left. And it's just another voice in the mind, one that's very, very seductive. So there are certainly people who've been abused, and it's difficult, even when one is approaching death, to forgive an abuser, but at least one can forgive oneself. And you say, what does it feel like? It feels like spaciousness, like connectedness. Stephen Levine tells the wonderful story, and he had a very difficult early life. He was in a prison. He was addicted to heroin. He was in a mental institution. And he was going around for quite some time saying, Stephen, I forgive you. And one day when he was meditating out in the woods and saying, Stephen, I forgive you, he felt forgiven. And he said, I felt so naked that I wanted to take back all the guilt and shame. But I decided, I'd worked so hard, I decided not to. Okay, so what it feels like to you, once again, I'm not sure, but it'll be some quality of connectedness to self, to spacious, and a spacious heart. What does a spacious heart feel like? What is emptiness? It's free of concept. There's not that voice with these concepts, you're not good enough, you're a bad child, you're weak, you're whatever it is. There's a sense of flow, of spaciousness.
Yeah. I like the, if it's not loving, nurturing, and tender, I tend to say that I don't need to believe those lies.
There you go. Perfect.
Lovely super ego comes in. There's several questions about being with someone who's dying, who doesn't really live in this world of non-dualism, or doesn't believe in God, or doesn't have faith, and
Right.
how to walk with them.
Okay. Well, there's a couple answers to that. One answer, the best answer is, if you're working with somebody who has not done spiritual practice, the best thing you can do is for you to go into one mind or connection with God, and then merge your mind with the person who's dying. You don't even have to say anything. You can be talking about the Giants' third base problem or what the weather is like or something. You're not talking about God or death or anything, but you're a living model of being pure consciousness, of being pure love. The second thing is there are all kinds of practices that don't depend on theism. There's the breath, there's just getting a person to investigate forgiveness or love or relaxation. I mean, when we're talking about conscious death or conscious life, there are all kinds of levels. The very basic level is be here now, and then there's be here now with love, and then there's the tantric understanding, and then there's wholeness, non-duality. And I have learned over the years that I can't force everybody to die well. People come to me and I try to model openness, and I try to, if it's appropriate, share some practices. But what I've learned is that I have to learn to let people suffer. That suffering is only suffering. And as Ramdas said, suffering is grace. Suffering is a result of grasping. Suffering is not the result of the environment, it's the result of our relationship, our reactivity to the environment. So that if somebody is suffering and you help them work with that suffering, or even just let them suffer, maybe they need to go down to the bottom before they can start coming up, then maybe at the moment of death, they've had that preparation so that something can happen in that moment.
Yeah. It's a hard practice to let someone be with their suffering. We're so trained to want to fix, and it leads to this question of like compassion and empathy, like what's the difference between the two, and offering that when someone's suffering.
So just going back to the other thing that and it's so much harder to let somebody suffer if it's somebody you love, if it's your child or your spouse or your parent. And it's particularly difficult if it's yourself. Okay, so empathy means being able to feel somebody's pain. And empathy is required for compassion, but compassion is taking it a step further. You can be empathetic without being compassionate. Compassion includes a wish that the other person be free from suffering, right? So you can be empathetic. Here's somebody suffering. I really feel that, but I'm getting out of here because this is not something I want to deal with, right? It's my empathy, I get what you're feeling, but that's your problem, not mine. I'm out of here. Yeah. Whereas compassion, your heart is touched, your heart is moved by that suffering, and you're moved to do something.
Yeah. And I think that's where working on ourselves to be able to hold suffering so that that empathy can turn into compassion when we're with someone and we feel that. There's a couple of questions about like a couple of people saying that they're comfortable with their own dying, but watching someone else is harder. And one woman's talking about how both she and her daughter have cancer. And it sounds like hers is terminal and her daughter's, who's 24, is pretty aggressive. And she said she has peace with her own, but is having a hard time surrendering to her daughter's cancer journey.
Right. So I would suggest that, how can I say this, be delicate and friendly here. Okay, so it's fairly easy to have peace with a concept of death. But as long as anybody has any contraction, that's your fear of death. So that the place where this woman is having a hard time with her daughter's death, that's going to be there as she is dying. Right? So that working with what closes in her heart when she thinks about her daughter dying will prepare her to die as well as support her daughter in dying. And I remember a time when I was in an automobile accident. It could have been a major event, but it turned out just to be a fender bender. But cars were kind of spinning out of control on a Bay Area freeway here. And when my car stopped, and at this point I had been working with dying people for quite some time, I figured I don't have much fear of dying. But my legs didn't work. My body was so afraid that I couldn't stand up for like a minute or two. So that you may feel that you don't have intellectual fear of death, but I would bet that if I held your head underwater long enough, you'd be afraid of death, which is a natural thing. I'm not at all being critical, but wherever you or I or this mother or anyone feels that tightening, that's fear of death. And that's something to work with. And the more you or I or she can work with that, the more then we're support to the people around us.
Luke, and this speaks into a question that Luke asked about, like this fear of death being almost like a primal fear, or if they're, and like he was talking about walking in the woods and trying to be open and relaxed, but then like a twig snaps and that like primal fear comes up.
Right.
So it's not
well,
like a similar
one of
process.
Maharaji's favorite sayings was sub-ek, it's all one, right? And you and I and everybody has been in that state at times when you're chanting God's name, or you're out in nature, or you're with somebody you really love a lot, and you just feel that oneness. But that again and again, we fall back into separateness. And as long as there's a me and a you who are separate, then there's going to be fear. So, I mean, if I want you to like me, or if I want you to not like me, or if I want you to have some relationship with me, or if I want your money, or, whatever relationship there is, or I'm your father and I don't want you to suffer, and you start suffering and I get caught in that, then that's the place where I'm separate. Whereas that the joy of being with Maharaji was that he was not separate. Mm. And that any lack of relationship was because I was pulling back. And whenever I would open, he would be completely available. And just imagine that lesson moment to moment to moment that we're all having, that as soon as we're feeling disconnected or separate or afraid, can we deepen faith in that moment? Whatever you have faith in, what do you have faith in? Do you have faith in Buddha, Dharma, Sangha, in Christ, in Buddha, in Maharaji? I had a student in one of my groups who said the only thing she had faith in was the law of gravity. So she was a difficult student. I think she was kind of kidding.
Maybe. So there's several questions that are pointing to the same thing. And it's this sort of losing a sense of clarity in the process of dying, whether it's because of Alzheimer's or having lots of drugs in the system or going into a panic.
Right.
Can you speak about that? And
Yeah.
Yeah,
that's really an important question. And let's see how we can summarize this really well. So I've been around people who have died, have been in comas, people have been demented, people have had a lot of opiates in their bloodstream, so they couldn't really focus. And my sense of it was that in the time preceding death, they were still conscious and they were learning something. So that suppose somebody has a loved one who's going through a couple years of dementia at the end of life. This person is learning about being receptive, not being in control, being quiet, being comfortable with not knowing, qualities that aren't really cultivated in most people's lives. And it might be very useful then to help the person in the letting go at the end. So it's not all those moments leading up to death, it's that your whole life brings you to that moment where consciousness is leaving the body. And in that moment then, it's not really dependent on how many drugs are in your bloodstream in that moment, or if you're just in an automobile accident. People have had near-death experiences where their bodies were in accidents, or they were burned, or they were on an operating table with all kinds of drugs. And as soon as consciousness leaves the body and starts the next part of the spiritual dying process. So there's the physical dying process, the brain and the heart stop. It takes just a minute or two. There's the spiritual dying process, which can begin way before physical death and certainly continues for hours, if not days after physical death. So that as consciousness leaves the body, it's not affected by what's happening to the body. And all of these encounters with after death, near death experiences say that there's a sense of wholeness, integrity. People who've been blind all of their life in the near death experience can see what's going on in the room. Okay, people who have all kinds of limitations, as soon as they're out of the body, that's not affecting them.
Great. I think, yeah, you've answered several questions in that answer, so thank you. There's a couple questions. You brought up the mother and how that begins to, like, we begin to see the mother in all of it. And there's a couple questions about talking about that more, and specifically, many people have had challenging relationships with their mothers. Right. And so it gets conflated, this idea of like the mother we experienced, and then this idea of like a mother that takes care of us. So can you just talk about overcoming that or deepening into the divine mother, whatever you would call her,
Great.
more?
Yeah. I was at a Tibetan workshop once, Tibetan Buddhist workshop, and the Lama came out and said, we're all going to open our hearts for this practice. So please think about your mother. And they said, oh, wait a minute, I forgot I'm in America, and think about your mother doesn't mean your heart's going to open. And in a way that's kind of funny, but in a way that's profoundly sad. I mean, where he lives, you think about your mother and your heart opens up, right? Where we live, maybe not so much. So that the mother we're talking about here is the mother with a capital M. There's a wonderful Bengali poet, Ram Prasad Sen, who was Ramakrishna's favorite poet. He was a devotee of Mother Kali. And he said, it's a very long poem, but it starts out saying something like, I'm paraphrasing, "Oh mother, in this life, either I will devour you or you will devour me. And I vow that it is you that I will devour." And what he's saying here is that in any moment where I am lost in fear, where I am caught in the content of my life, I'm being devoured by the content, by the mother. And any moment where I'm fully present, my heart is open, I'm mindful, I'm aware of pure consciousness, if you will, then I'm devouring the mother. And certainly people who have had a difficult birth mother, it makes it harder to do this. I'm not in any way diminishing the difficulty of having a psychological trauma early in life. At the same time, some of the people I know who have made the most remarkable spiritual progress are people who were really driven to awaken because they were suffering. And I've had friends who had really loving mothers, birth mothers, and they just kind of floated through life and never got very deeply into practice because like everything is kind of okay. And so consequently, without diminishing how hard abuse or trauma or early suffering is, the practice still remains. Can we open to our life right now, which from a tantric standpoint can be seen as a relationship with the mother? If you don't want to call it the mother, I mean, it's really metaphorical. And at the same time, it's completely real. I mean, these beings like Kali and Hanuman and Durga and Mother Mary exist in our imaginations, but they're also completely real. I mean, I know people, and in fact, I am people who have had direct darshan of certain deities. So that when you go to bed tonight and you put your head down on the pillow, is that the pillow you're putting your head down on, or is that the mother's lap? Right? Can we realize it's not too late to have a healthy childhood? Right? That yes, it's tragic in some way that young children have to suffer, but we each have to deal with what our set of circumstances is, and dealing with that, having faith, having a connection with God. Maharaji would say, love is the strongest medicine. Love is stronger than electricity. And there's no suffering so great that love cannot overcome it.
There's a couple of questions about grief. One is why? What's the purpose? And another is an experience of someone currently dealing with losing someone and grieving, and feeling like they failed their father in the process and wanting peace, but grieving around it.
They failed. I didn't quite understand
that. So just how to deal with grief and loss. I recently lost my father. I tried to be supportive, but felt like I failed him somehow. So how do I find the peace?
Okay.
Yeah, so they're both a little bit around grief.
Okay.
Dealing with grief.
So in terms of failing somebody who has died, that isn't so much grief maybe as guilt, and it's not too late to work with forgiveness, to forgive yourself even though you weren't conscious enough or awake enough to do what now you think you should have done then. There's a wonderful quote from Rumi where he says, grief is the garden of compassion. Grief are negative emotions arising in response to feeling separate. Somebody died, somebody left, I lost an identity, I'm separate from that. Compassion is the quality of the open heart that's connected. So that one very important part of the spiritual path is transmuting feelings of grief and separation into feelings of connection and compassion. And one can do something called conscious grief work, where you invite grief to come. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. You're in a protected place. And what does it feel like to grieve? Not I'm grieving because somebody died, or I'm grieving because I didn't do something when I should have. But what does it feel like in the body? Letting go of concept, having a naked, direct experience of the grieving process. And only through this meeting, this loving mindfulness, this loving awareness, will healing begin to happen. As long as we stay fixated in the story, oh, I didn't do this thing for my father, woe is me, I'm a bad child, oh, woe is me. As long as you stay in that relationship, as unpleasant as it is, it protects you from feeling the separation, the grief itself. As the story keeps us, the concepts keep us, the narrative keeps us from directly meeting the suffering and healing it. So that the great paradox of spiritual practice is that we're so conditioned to try to get away from suffering, but only by opening into suffering will healing happen. And everybody in this room is running around with some background level of grief and of anxiety that most of us assume is human nature, that's what it's like to be a human, that we're grieving and we're anxious. And human nature is intrinsically, it's wholeness, it's pure consciousness meeting experience. So that can we begin to work with that background grief, that background anxiety that's like the bass line of a jazz quartet or something that's always like playing in the background, and begin to pay attention to that. What is the message? What does it feel like to embrace something that we've been trying to get away from?
You talk about working with it, which I appreciate. And I'm just having the sense of that it's so painful.
So painful, you said?
So painful
Yeah.
to turn towards that sense of separation, and really, like, even the concept of working with it feels a little vague. I don't know if
Okay, but so there's a difference though, Jackie, between pain and suffering. Pain is mandatory. Having a body, having a personality that's going to be pain. Suffering is optional, right? I mean, maybe the easiest example is physical pain. You can have physical pain and suffer, or you can have physical pain and not suffer. I've been around people who are dying a lot, and often when people are dying, they're in pain. And I have been around people literally who are approaching death. They're in so much physical pain, their body is like writhing. And I say, how are you doing today? And they say, I've never felt better in my life, because the pain was even ejecting them from identification with the body. Are you the pain? Is it my pain, or is it the pain? Right? Are you the body? Is it your body that's going to die? Do you really own this body? In English, we say, I am afraid. In Spanish, we say, translated, I have fear, yo tengo miedo. In Tibetan, we say, fear is here. So just in the way we relate to emotions in the English language, by thinking and speaking, it's more difficult not to identify with the passing mind-body states, becoming not spacious, but attached, grabbing onto conceptually. So that we're not aware of our body, we're aware of concepts of the body. We're not aware of our mind. We're aware of concepts. We're living in concepts. I have a PhD in mathematics. I'm I'm an expert. I'm trying to get over being an expert.
I hear that. I hear that. So we've gone a little over time. I do want to ask at least one more question, because there's probably 5 or 6 people who have asked it in various ways about wanting to get more involved with the dying process or with people who are dying. Can you talk about how one might approach that?
How might get more involved?
Yeah, whether it's with your organization or.
Yeah, well, first of all, the Living Dying Project has an online training that people have taken from all over the world that allows them to be an adjunct volunteer if they want, or they don't have to become a volunteer, but it's the basic training for spiritual support of the dying. And whether you take this training or not, the best training is having a spiritual practice, working with your own suffering, working with opening your own heart, and then in your own community. I don't know, I mean, some people are way out in the middle of nowhere, some people are in big urban centers, but there are people dying. And if you just let people know that you're interested in this work, that you're preparing yourself, you have some training, that maybe friends will come and say, could you help me or my friend? Or on the other hand, you become a hospice volunteer, or you become a emotional support person in the local hospital. As I mentioned before, Trungpa said, until one comes into intimate contact with death, your spiritual practice will have the quality of you being a dilettante. Mm-hmm. So I'm not doing all this work because of Mother Teresa in drag. I want to awaken. I'm not interested in death. I'm interested in awakening. And yet I find by being around death, it keeps awakening me. It keeps showing me that now is the moment to be present, because I don't know how many more moments there are going to be. And the most beautiful Americans I've ever been around, with very few exceptions, are people who are almost dead because they're willing to be themselves. So it's a great blessing to be able to do this work. In my humble opinion, the best spiritual practice for this weird time in which we're living is an inner contemplative practice combined with an outer relationship with dying. I know a lot of people are doing one or the other. People are working professionally with dying who aren't meditating, and people who are meditating aren't working with dying. And in either case, you can really dig your heels in. I know a lot of really grumpy meditators, to be honest with you.
I've been one at times.
Right.
Thank you. That's so helpful. I want to end with just one question that's a little lighter. Not that these haven't been light, but someone's noticing your lovely dog in the background.
Well, it's not my dog, it's my son's dog who's visiting. Henry, you want to say hi to everybody? Yeah,
and they're asking about pets as teachers and heart openers. Do you have anything to say about that? The little Ewok there.
This is Henry Hiro, Hiro. He's a Shih Tzu. And certainly Henry's not afraid of death, so he's my teacher.
Yeah, and pets really do seem to open our hearts.
Yeah, and you know, I've had people at my retreats who were grieving the loss of a pet. I taught a retreat once in Manhattan where it was really intense. There were people whose, one woman, her husband had died 3 days before the workshop. Another person's son had died a week before. Somebody else, it was the exact year anniversary of her spouse dying, her husband dying. And the person who was grieving the most was a guy whose cat had died 7 years before. He still couldn't get over that. So my son's visiting for a week or two. We don't know how long. And he brought Henry. So Henry and I have a real love affair here. I kind of spoil him, I think is why I give him treats, but don't tell his mommy that, because she doesn't.
Yeah, there's something about interspecies love. It's just a special thing. There's several questions that I wasn't able to get to, so I apologize for those who.
So if somebody has like a really pressing question, you can send me an email at dale@livingdying.org. Maybe somebody could just put that onto the chat function there,
That'd be great.
my email address, and I'll try to respond to people.
Great. Dale, thank you so much. It's always such an incredible pleasure to talk with you. And
It's always great to be with you too,
background
Jackie.
is really lovely to hear those different things.
Thank
So
you, everybody.
thank you all for being here.